Ladies and gentlemen, judging by the comments, people have been shocked at a video that we put up last week on our YouTube channel and on our Instagram page. The title of this video is "The Government Took and Transitioned Her Child. A Grieving Mother Testifies." Now, the mother is a woman by the name of Abigail Maritinez. She immigrated from El Salvador, and on this video, she testifies that the state of California took her child from her because Abigail, the mother of this child, did not want her 15-year-old daughter to be transitioned. But it turned out that the state of California took that child from her, put her in some kind of halfway house, began to transition her, and from that point, she spiraled out of control to the point that she kneeled before an oncoming train. She committed suicide. And Abigail Maritinez on this video is reliving what happened to her child and said, please do not continue to advance this gender ideology madness in our schools. It is not helping. It is hurting students. You can see this video on our YouTube channel. We're not going to play it here. Abigail has a pretty thick accent, so it's probably better that you watch the video so you can see the subtitling of what she's saying. But we have some questions that we're going to delve into today and try and answer. How prevalent is this, where the government in certain states is taking children away from their parents against their will? Secondly, where do the candidates stand on this issue? What would Donald Trump and Kamala Harris do if elected? Would they be for or against taking kids from their parents and transitioning those kids against the will of their parents? Because this, if the Democrats get elected, will become a national issue. We'll get into that. And then also, where do they stand on making sexual orientation and gender identity protected classes, which could criminalize any opposition to LGBTQ behavior, including opposition that may come from the Bible? What would that do to children, and how would it affect the ability of parents to protect their children? And is there anyone right now advocating lowering the age of consent? And in light of all this, what can parents and voters do? Well, we're bringing back someone who really understands this issue very well. Her name is Laura Hanford. We had her on the show back in June to talk about this issue or parallel issues related to this. But due to the sensitivity of this issue and the fact that it seems to be advancing in our culture, we wanted to have Laura back. She works at the Heritage Foundation with my good friend, Dr. Jay Richards, who is an amazing Renaissance man. Jay is good at everything, but Laura is especially dialed in on this issue. So here she is, ladies and gentlemen, Laura Bryant Hanford. Thanks for joining us again, Laura. How are you?
I'm doing well, Frank. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, you're the one that I needed to have back. In fact, I remember when I was investigating this issue, I texted Jay and I said, Jay, can you help me with this? And he just gave me your number. He said, Laura's tracking with this. She knows what's going on. So let's start at the top, Laura. This idea that certain children are being taken from their parents by state governments, how prevalent is this? How often does this happen?
Well, I think people think that it's just a very peripheral issue. Surely that doesn't happen. But the reality is that it is happening, and it has been happening for years. Abigail Martinez's story is one of the first ones that came to light. But California has been doing this for years. Ohio took away a child in 2018. There's all kinds of states that are doing it now and that are implementing systems in readiness to do this. So we can cover several of these stories, but there are stories across the U.S. of kids.
Can I stop you right there and ask you about Ohio? Now, we understand California. California is a far left blue state, but Ohio is generally a red state, although they have voted for unfettered abortion. We know that. So how did this happen in Ohio? They have a Republican governor in Ohio. How did this happen there?
You're right. That's an excellent question. And it's one of the one of the tentacles of this ideology and this push that people don't realize unless they get stuck in some sort of contact with the system. Ohio, this past year, actually passed a ban, overrode the governor's veto on gender-affirming medicine. And they have actually banned so-called gender-affirming care. It's a very Orwellian term. But there is a huge, very strong presence of LGBTQ activists in Ohio. And more importantly, Ohio is one of four states that have a county that the Biden administration years ago poured $10 million of money into in a grant to overhaul the welfare system to make it more LGBTQ affirming. And so Ohio actually has a county that was celebrated, and we can't cover all of it because there's so much, but there's a wonderful reporter, Meg Brock, at the Daily Caller, that has done a series on this issue with Caitlin Richardson over there, putting in requests for freedom of information on what this grant, this $10 million grant to overhaul welfare, was for. And this county in Ohio actually put together a secret database tracking parents whose kids were still at home, but they weren't affirming them enough, according to them. So over 50% of the parents in this database had kids still at home, and they're tracking things like, are they taking them to LGBTQ-friendly associations? How are they doing with affirming with pronouns and things like this? So one point I think that people need to be aware of is just because you're in a red state, even a state that has a ban on gender medicine, the child protective systems in that state are being trained and funded by people who firmly believe it is abuse to not affirm a child as the opposite sex if the child says they are.
We're going to put a link. We're going to put so many links in the show notes, friends, because Laura has all the receipts for all of this. But how would anybody in government, Ohio government, know that a kid in a house somewhere is identifying as trans? How would they even know that?
Well, some of these had to do specifically with people who might have had contact with the child protective system. And kids get pulled into this and families get pulled into this from all different means, because you have what are called mandatory reporters. So that's anyone from often a clergy person to a teacher or a doctor, anyone who is by law required to report if they think there's a risk of abuse. So the problem is that you have all these mandatory reporters in all these different systems, including at school, who, if they are trained, as they are increasingly trained to do so, believe that if they're trained to believe that a child who is not affirmed as the opposite sex is a child at risk of abuse or actually being abused, they will then report that child to the local welfare system, child welfare system. And then that in Ohio seems to have put them on the tracker. And the crazy thing is they want to extend this to schools. They want to start tracking. They have questionnaires for kids as young as 3 about about their gender. So kids coming into their system, they will have questionnaires as young as 3 about their gender.
It matters who you vote for, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, the governor in Ohio, Mike DeWine, I think, decided he wasn't going to sign the bill that said you shouldn't transition children. But enough Republicans in the House and Senate of Ohio were in those chambers in order to override that veto. So it is a law now in Ohio that you can't do this to a child. It is child abuse, ladies and gentlemen, to try and transition a child. A child can't give informed consent, and it doesn't work anyway. There is no way to change your biology. You can change your mind. You can't change your biology. We've talked about this on this program several times. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to ask Laura about a study, well, actually, the revelation that just came out recently where doctors were hiding the data on so-called gender-affirming care. That gender-affirming care doesn't work, yet doctors were hiding that because it wasn't politically expedient. We're going to get to that and where the candidates stand, so don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turk, on the American Family Radio Network. We're back in just 2 minutes. Please don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm old. When I was born in 1961. And at that time, marriage was not a political issue. Sex was not a political issue. Gender was not a political issue. Abortion was not a political issue. But these have all become political issues over my lifetime because the state, the government, began getting much more theological. They started to tell us that marriage wasn't what we thought it was, that gender and sex weren't what we thought they were for all of human history. They started to tell us that an unborn child is not a human being, even though we know it is. They started to get a lot more theological. Instead of just building roads and protecting us from external and internal threats for the military and the police, they decided they were going to get a lot more theological. When I say they, it's really us, because the church hasn't been involved politically enough to make sure that they didn't try and redefine reality according to these whims that have come across our land in recent decades. So if you're saying, well, Christians ought not be involved politically, you ought to stop right now and say, wait a minute, why not? Are only atheists qualified to run the country? But secondly, these issues are now theological and they're in the political realm. So Christians, if we're going to love God and love our neighbor, we have to have a say because we want to put laws in place that protect innocent people from evil. And preventing so-called gender-affirming care is one way you can protect children from evil. But I got to ask our guest today, Laura Bryant Hanford of the Heritage Foundation. Laura, I saw a headline. I didn't get a chance to read the article yet, but I saw a headline that certain doctors were hiding data that showed that gender-affirming care did not help children. Can you unpack that for us?
Yes. So this is one of the really consistent things happening now is that the doctors who are doing the research or the assessment on these issues are actually suppressing evidence when it doesn't go in their favor. So the doctor that you're talking about is a woman named Johanna Kennedy Olson, and Olson Kennedy. She is married to a trans activist who I believe is transgender, him or herself. And they are some of the biggest proponents of the medicine behind this. And she received a multi-million-dollar grant from NIH on researching, on doing these experiments on children. But come to find out, she actually has been suppressing the evidence because apparently it's not showing what she wants it to show. And I will say that has also been the case with the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, which commissioned a series of 12 studies from Johns Hopkins to see what the benefits were of so-called gender-affirming care. Turns out that they didn't like the results, and so they suppressed the publication of all but 2 of the studies, which were sort of middling ones. So, and what's also interesting is the Biden-Harris representative for all this, a transgender physician, Dr. Rachel Levine, he goes by, it's actually a man, who's the chief pediatrician in the country, claiming falsely that this is evidence-based and life-saving care and medically necessary. We now, because of discovery in a related court case, have the emails and the discussions showing that he actively pushed this association to remove the age limits for hormones and surgeries in the latest standards of care. So the standards of care are what professional medical groups publish as sort of best practices, how physicians should treat their patients. In this case, I mean, let that sink in. The leading pediatrician claiming to treat kids with gender dysphoria actually behind the scenes suppressed and it successfully got removed any sort of age limits for surgeries or hormones given to children. So we're talking, and this NIH study by the doctor that you first asked me about could give hormones and puberty blockers to kids as young as 8. So this is just experimentation on an outrageous scale. And the more that comes out, the more we realize it's nothing. It's a house of cards, but kids' bodies and souls are being destroyed by this.
Chloe Cole, who was a teenager who had depression and autism and some other comorbidities, was transitioned by her doctors. I think at 15 years old, she may have had her breast cut off, about that age. And now she's 19 and she is suing her doctors because she could not give informed consent. And she said they did Nazi-like experiments on me. I document this, friends, in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. If you want the story, it's in there. And this is happening in the UK. That's why they're closing their gender clinics in the UK, Laura. What is going to happen here, however, if you have Biden's Rachel Levine, is he unilaterally saying that now doctors can operate on kids as young as 8? Can he unilaterally say that? Or are these just non-binding guidelines according to the association? What is this? Is this a legal issue or just sort of an association issue that he says 8 years old is as low as you can go?
Well, he didn't say it. He took off any restrictions with
any restrictions.
Any restrictions with the world with WPATH. So they're a couple separate things. That's the international body that every doctor supposedly refers to, but they've really been revealed to be just fraudulent in how they handle evidence and research, and how they made their recommendations also with pressure from the head of the ACLU, the main lawyer for the ACLU, Chase Strangio, who is a woman who has transitioned to present as a man. So that attorney also worked with, they figured, well, it's going to maybe impede our efforts to promote this stuff in the US. So we want to keep it out of any medical standards of reference, which of course is completely unethical, because you don't make medical standards based on how they're going to be viewed in a lawsuit. How was this discovered, though? How did this come to light that they were hiding the evidence that so-called gender-affirming care did not help children? Well, there's different ways that it's been done. Most of the studies, in fact, pretty much all of the studies are pretty weak to begin with, and they either set up the study in such a way that they might not have a control group, or they change the hypothesis after the study starts because they realize they aren't meeting the goals that they had set out, or there's all kinds of confounding variables they don't account for. There's a lot of things wrong with all the studies. The systematic reviews in Britain that were considered, a pediatrician was appointed for 4 years to review all these studies, and they concluded the evidence was so bad and the risks so high that they're basically curtailing pediatric gender transition in the UK, and most of the European states are in that camp. They now view the US as an outlier. So the US is pushing full steam ahead, but it's because, and Biden and his administration, through all the rules that they're implementing and all, of course, their official statements and the research, the millions of dollars of money that is going to back all these things, they are sort of creating soft law and or sort of stronger law, if you will, to push and protect this stuff. And the fascinating thing about some of this discovery is that they are the ones that sued Alabama over the gender transition medicine ban that Alabama had put through. So the U.S. sued Alabama, and the attorneys for Alabama were brilliant in how they responded. They said, okay, if you're going to say that we're not practicing medicine according to the best standards, we are going to subpoena the records for WPATH and ask, how did you come to these standards of care? And so the fact that the U.S. sued Alabama, who was trying to ban this medicine, is what actually led to probably the biggest embarrassment on this issue. And it's the gift that keeps on giving for people that are trying to protect children, because the more that comes out, the worse they look. And it's all because of a lawsuit that they started. So it's now actually somewhat... No, and I say now there's a case before the United States Supreme Court that's going to be argued on December 4th. The United States, the Biden-Harris administration, is suing the state of Tennessee for their law trying to protect children against this barbarism where they're cutting off perfectly healthy sex organs of minors. So that's happening. How is this... what is the challenge from the Biden-Harris administration to Tennessee? What are they saying Tennessee's doing wrong in this court case? Well, they're essentially trying to claim that kids have a right to this affirming care because it's part of their identity. So they want to establish that it's like you're discriminating on it's like you're if you were discriminating against somebody on the basis of sex or race. So they're trying to portray gender identity, this concept that has no basis in science or medicine. It's a purely metaphysical belief, as you explained. It's just sense that your inner sense of feeling trumps biological reality. They are trying to turn that into a class, what's sort of a protected class, so that if a parent tries to say, hold on, let's not take action based on these feelings, that turns into, according to Kamala Harris and Biden and Waltz and everybody who takes this position, which they do, that turns into discrimination against the child for who they are. There's this terminology they throw around that's their authentic self. And so if in fact the Department of Justice wins, that means that parents will lose the right to take action to protect their children against permanent consequences to their bodies and their mental health and their emotional health.
This matters. It matters who you vote for, ladies and gentlemen. Your own kids can be taken from you and transitioned if Kamala Harris gets her way, if Tim Walz gets his way, if Joe Biden gets his way. I mean, this is absolute madness. I wonder what they would say if an anorexic said, my authentic self is I'm an anorexic and I'm owed liposuction. Or if your daughter came to you and said, I'm a mermaid, does she then therefore have the right to be thrown in the ocean? I mean, this is madness. And this is being pushed from the highest levels of government on our children. What do you think is going to happen in that case? What's going to be the position of the state of Tennessee? Because I know you and Jay kind of probably worked on that law, didn't you? That law that was passed in Tennessee.
Well, I think Jay did. My focus was different at the time, but certainly there's a whole group of allies on this. Do No Harm, Heritage, Family Policy Alliance, a whole group of them, of folks that have worked to protect kids on this issue. And I think it's really fascinating because in 2018, when that child that I mentioned was taken from his parents and given to his grandparents so that the grandparents could transition the child with hormones, there was no law protecting children from puberty blockers or hormones or surgeries being used to transition them. Now, 6 years later, we have half the U.S. states doing it, and the Supreme Court about to take up the case.
All right, well, we're going to cover more of that and where the candidates stand in detail right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. My guest, Laura Bryant Hanford, working with the Heritage Foundation, and my friend Jay Richards there. Don't go anywhere. We've got a lot more back in 2 minutes. Friends, if you go to voteyourfaith.net, that's voteyourfaith.net, we've got a lot of presentations up there and a lot of resources up there, including resources related to this discussion we're having here right now that will help you make an informed decision on how to vote biblically in this election. In fact, there's a digital voter guide up there. If you go to voteyourfaith.net and look for the ivoterguide.com, it's a link on voteyourfaith.net. If you go to voteyourfaith.net, you'll see it down there. If you click on that link and put your address in, no matter where you live in the United States, it's going to tell you who's on your ballot, your personal ballot, from the top all the way to the bottom. And don't think just the presidency is important. There's so much down ballot, so many down ballot races that are important, from senators to congressmen to your state senators and state congressmen in your own individual states and your local elections. Also, there are 10 states that are voting on unfettered abortion that you ought to vote against because it's abortion all the way up to the moment of conception, just like Kamala Harris wants it. Those states are Arizona. They are Florida. I'm doing this from the top of my head. Montana, South Dakota. Where else, Laura? Do you know any of the other ones? I'm just trying to think. Missouri, Illinois. There's a few more I can't think of right now, but look, what's that?
Did you mention New York? Definitely.
New York. Yeah, New York has an awful equality. It's called equality amendment on their ballot, which you don't want to vote for because it's going to do exactly what we're talking about here on this show, that your kids are basically going to be able to be taken from you because their authentic self is being denied by you. Well, let's talk about that, Laura. Give us some examples on how kids are actually taken from their parents.
Sure. And there's really some common threads. It's usually the kids that are a little bit on the fringes, uncomfortable already socially, and they get targeted and kind of pulled in by this ideology. A huge proportion of them are autistic. So, for instance, there's a case recently of a young man who was taken, who had been struggling with sexuality, with self-harm, and his parents. This is a young man in Maryland whose parents are from a conservative evangelical family. And this young man, they took him to DC Children's National Hospital because he was threatening. They felt he was at risk of suicide. But what happened once he got there was, and this is a very typical pattern, social workers in the hospital and the psychiatrist there got to him, and suddenly he's supposedly claiming to be a girl when he's actually a boy. And so even though this child had struggled, had multiple struggles, suddenly they zeroed in on that. They did multiple holds, emergency 3-day holds, re-upping his emergency hold in the hospital, and they never gave him back to his parents. They ended up putting him, the state of Maryland put him in a foster care situation with a woman who was supposedly affirming, and he ended up trying to commit suicide again. His parents started seeing on his social media sexualized picture. He started getting they would see things coming across paperwork for STIs that he was suddenly being tested for when he had not been sexually active before. And the parents couldn't do anything about it because the state was claiming that he had to be affirmed and he had to stay with this person. He's now with the transgender chaplain from DC Children, somebody named Lavender Kelly, who is affirming his supposed authentic self. And so there's a lawsuit that they have filed. And the hospital wanted them to remove the parts of the Bible and what they were communicating with him that had anything to do with traditional sexuality. So this is this family, there's families from all kinds of backgrounds. This family is an African-American family that lived in the DC area and who thought they were caring for their child. There's a case in Indiana that made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, although the Supreme Court didn't take it, of a young man. Similarly, he was threatening self-harm. They were concerned, his parents were concerned that he might be suicidal. They took him to the hospital. And even though originally they were accused of not being affirming enough, eventually those allegations of abuse on those grounds were dropped. But the state kept him on the grounds that he was not safe with his parents because they wanted and told them they couldn't talk about their religious beliefs on gender with him. And so basically they kept him. He never went back to his family either. And there are several stories like this. In Sage's case, she had been trafficked after her school. In a case, Blair versus Appomattox, she was a young girl that we talked about last time who was transitioned secretly at her school, assaulted in the boys' bathroom they told her she could use, and then ran away and was trafficked. And when she was found in Maryland, the judge in Maryland, which is one of the 4 counties the Biden administration has poured money into on this stuff, Prince George's County, but this was in Baltimore, but the judge in Maryland wouldn't return her to her parents because supposedly they were abusing her on the grounds of misgendering. So there's a lot of ways. Once you're in the system, it's kind of like Hotel California. You can get in and you can never get out. So any part of the system that touches a child sort of pulls them in, and then it's very hard for parents to get them back.
Jesus said, anyone who causes any one of these little ones to stumble, any one of these little ones to stumble who believe in me, it would be better to have a millstone hung around their neck and be tossed into the sea. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can't get off your couch and go vote against this, I don't know what to say. I mean, how do you not be opposed to this? How do you not want to say, this can't happen? We can't do this to children. We can't do this to parents. The government is not your kid's parent. You are. The government doesn't have the right to come in and say, your kid, because she thinks she's a boy, should be transitioned. Kids go through phases. We know that. 80 to 90% of the kids that have this so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria grow out of it by the time they're 18, and 96% of it 96% of them grow out of it by the time they're 26, when their brains are fully formed. This is a mental delusion. It's not to be affirmed, no more than anorexia is to be affirmed, or mermaidism is to be affirmed, or furryism is to be affirmed. This is madness. And yet there are Christians out there. Christianity Today came out and said, well, maybe it'd be better if you didn't vote for anyone. Wake up. I mean, this is ridiculous. And this is happening. And Christians are quiet. 30 million Christians did not vote in the last election. If Christians would vote and vote biblically, kids wouldn't be taken from their parents and transitioned. So next time I'll tell you how I really think about this, Laura. Sorry, it just frustrates me so much. And I've seen an ad because Kamala Harris said this. There's an ad where she says she actually wants the government to pay to transition prisoners, men who want to become women, so they can then be put into the women's prison. And what do they do there? Some of them don't get the surgery and they rape the women.
That's right.
And this is what Kamala Harris wants to do. She wants to use your tax dollars because a convicted felon, a convicted murderer somehow has the right to your tax dollars so he can be transitioned. I don't get this. How does anybody think that's a good idea?
Yeah, it's really wild, and it's not just the prisoners or the taxpayer money. It's also that Waltz and Harris believe that the government should fund the hormones and potentially surgeries for children who are in foster care, which is close to 500,000. If you count kinship care, it's even more. They think that these children should be, and they are pouring millions of dollars of resources into setting up systems so these children can get the quote unquote care that they want to push on them. And so these kids who are already traumatized, if you're in the foster care system, you're by definition there because you suffered some sort of trauma or you were in a bad situation. Gender dysphoria is sort of a dissociative belief. But Biden and Harris put through, and Waltz did the same thing in his own state, they put through a new rule from the Health and Human Services that says these kids, if they identify as LGBTQ, can only go to a family that will affirm them in that. So essentially, they're only able now, thanks to Biden and Harris, this rule that's going to be implemented over the next 2 years, to go to a family that will further embed this dissociation in their minds and bodies.
Okay,
and there's no workaround for religious families.
Where does Trump and Vance stand on these issues? What would they do? Could they change this? Where are they?
Well, yes. I mean, things would change dramatically if will be dramatically different depending on who is in office, because Trump and Vance have been very clear that they don't support pediatric transition. They've also been and Vance has, recently said it's crazy. Trump has said similar things. Trump has actually said he will he will ban federal funding from a school that teaches gender ideology, which would be very effective because that's where it's getting in to the groundwater with all these kids. That's really ground zero for kids starting to believe that they are the opposite sex.
Conversely, Biden-Harris let me say one other thing, because what you just said there made me think of what's just happened recently, where the Biden-Harris administration said they would withhold lunch money from schools if they didn't allow men in those schools or boys in those schools to play in women's sports.
That's right.
So, I mean, the parties couldn't be further apart on this, Laura. Right. Sorry, go ahead, continue.
No, that's right. Prisons, that would stop this. And locking in, I mean, it's mind-boggling that they think it's all right to lock in a male rapist and murderer, somebody who raped and murdered children and women, and they are locking that person in with a woman who might be in prison for theft or something, not even a violent crime. So in California, and that's California, that's Minnesota, both of those states, and the sports issue, of course, they feel that's a very clear divide as well, because Trump and Vance don't believe that women should be forced to compete and lose their opportunities against men or be injured. The prisons issue, and also this issue, like I said, this issue of gender affirming care and certainly parental rights. So it couldn't be, the difference could not be more stark.
Now, who is advocating the lowering of the age of consent?
Well, that is really part and parcel of this whole philosophy, because gender ideology was the evil mind brain, the evil product of these people's brains, who were fringe academics who themselves pushed pedophilia as an acceptable option. So they wanted to lower the age of consent and basically pretty much get rid of it. And it's part of what you see in the whole schools movement that Harris and Biden are promoting, where you teach children about sexuality from the earliest ages, because they view children as sexual from infancy on. And some of the founders of queer theory were involved in disgusting experiments with sexual arousal on kids. And so you see that same push to lower ages of consent in the states where this is prevalent, including California.
Much more of this wonderful, uplifting news, ladies and gentlemen, from the great Laura Bryant Hanford right after the break. You got to be informed on this so you know what to do. I know it's disconcerting, but don't go anywhere. I'm Frank Turek. We're back in just 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, the only thing necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. One of the things you can do, which is just a little bit more than nothing, is to vote. Why wouldn't you vote? 30 million Christians didn't vote in the last election, and the election was decided basically by 42,000 votes spread around certain states. Christians should be voting to protect innocent people from evil. That's the purpose of government. That's what Genesis 9:6 says, and Romans 13:4 says, that governments are instituted to protect innocent people from evil. And we need to vote to limit evil, to protect innocent people from evil. And if you don't think gender-affirming care isn't evil, if you don't think it's evil, you haven't looked into it enough. And that's what we're talking about today with Laura Bryant Hanford. Laura, what is the Equality Act? We need to talk about that, because Democrats have been trying to pass the Equality Act for quite a long time. If Kamala Harris wins and she gets a Democrat House and Senate, she could pass the Equality Act. What would that do to Christians and other people of conscience? What kind of rights would they lose?
Well, I think the biggest one for our purposes, and I wrote an article about this 4 years ago for the Christian Post, the biggest effect on the issue that we're talking about is that it would basically erase every legal definition of woman, so that men would have access to everything, the prisons, the lockers, as they do in blue states, but just by law and by right. So their right as a man in woman face essentially would trump the rights of girls and women in all these privacy spaces and everywhere else. Also, the Equality Act, which Kamala Harris is a huge proponent of, would erase the protections from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So there wouldn't be exemptions for any kind of public services or engagement that churches are part of. So it would be, enormously, it would be a watershed moment where really rights that parents have had and believers have had for, pretty much since the beginning of this country would be erased effectively.
So you could be fined or imprisoned for not using pronouns?
Sure. That's already, there are places where you're losing kids over that already.
Mm-hmm.
And
you could lose your children. This is nationally now. It doesn't matter if you're living in a red state. Right. If this thing is passed, you don't have the right to follow what the Bible says. You can't oppose LGBTQ behavior in any way. You basically lose your rights as a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or just somebody who decides that they have a conscience problem. They cannot affirm such and such a behavior. You would be forced by the strong arm of government to adhere or pay the consequence, to either be fined or jailed or who knows, have your child taken from you. This is not equality, friends. This is the imposition of a tyrannical viewpoint, an unreal viewpoint, an unnatural viewpoint, a viewpoint that goes against natural law, goes against the laws of nature, goes against the laws of the Bible or God's law as expressed in the Bible, which is consistent with natural law, goes against all of that. That's what the so-called Equality Act would bring. It wouldn't bring equality. It would actually bring disequality, because anybody that disagreed their position would basically be criminalized, Laura.
Right. And I think that's one thing that I've tried to convey to friends that are squeamish about voting. And I understand that. I understand people's concerns. But the issue is, are you going to let that squeamishness keep you from having any say at all in the laws that govern you and your children? Or are you going to be down the road when those rights are taken away? Are you going to have the courage to actually engage in civil disobedience and what will be criminal behavior? Like, why would you not exercise the right to shape the laws rather than wait until you're actually against the laws?
Yeah, that's a very important point. And if you think that we're just alarmists here, this is already happening in some blue states and even a few red states, as we've already pointed out. What we're saying is that if the Democrats win next week, this could become nationalized. And go ahead, Laura.
People need to understand that Harris and Walz aren't just idle bystanders on this ideology. They are standard bearers. The only two states in the country that officially define not affirming as abuse are California and Minnesota. And they have years, maybe decades long records of standing for and pushing this stuff and imposing it on others. So this is not just, oh, well, a few people feel this way, maybe they'll have a say. No, this is full bore. They are standard bearers for these laws that are basically intended to assert control over our children, our lives, to promote their orthodoxy.
Now, you may have mentioned this earlier, but expound upon a little bit more. How have the rules that have come down from the Harris or the Biden-Harris administration affected the foster care system?
Right. Well, they basically, based on that Ohio county's experience that set up that tracker that I told you about, they decided that was such a wonderful idea that they needed to say that any child in the foster care system who identifies as LGBTQ, and kids are, because of trauma and all kinds of things, there is an overrepresentation. Anywhere from 30 to, in some places, 70% of kids would identify that way. The new rule that Biden and Harris pushed through says that any child that identifies that way has to be placed in a home that will affirm that child that way. So use the pronouns, do the hormones, take the kid to gay parades, gay pride parades, all those sorts of things. So there's no exemption for religious families. The only exemption is, well, you don't have to seek this designation of safe and appropriate that the rule requires. But if a child identifies that way, they can be in danger in a group home. A church will not be able to care for them or provide a loving home. So it is really, this means that there are hundreds of thousands of kids who are going to be left in dangerous situations rather than be put in homes that don't full on support the orthodoxy, even if these are parents that would love the child no matter what. So it's a very real and material barrier to caring for kids.
What can parents do about this, Laura?
Well, one, be very aware of your rights. So if CPS comes knocking, get an attorney. Do not basically engage without an attorney. But also, we are working on, there will be a model bill that states are going to be able to use. It's going to shortly be up on the Heritage website that explicitly addresses all the areas that this issue of abuse as not affirming covers. So it'll address how states can define abuse to not include gender affirming care. So it'll protect parents' rights to basically treat a boy as a boy and a girl as a girl. So you won't be able to take a kid away. You won't be able to start a CPS process against a child. You won't be able to train CPS workers that it's abuse to not affirm a child. The state, if it passes, any state that passes it, would not be able to contract with a training group or teach judges or social workers or teachers that it's abuse not to affirm a child. So we're trying to get at all the different areas where the tentacles of this ideology are just pressing so hard on families.
They are. Now, websites, where can they go to get more on this? We'll put a bunch in the show notes, but what main website should people go to if they want to learn more about this and learn more about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, that particular model bill for legislators to know about and for parents to ask their legislators to take this up will be up shortly on the Heritage website. So Heritage Foundation, and we can put that link up. And then we can provide a number of these articles. The Daily Caller does wonderful work tracking this issue and these issues that they figured out in Ohio and these other states, the research, all of that is on the Daily Caller website. So I would really recommend looking there as well. The Federalist does a lot of great stuff about this. That's who I've written for.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know that Christians look at both of these candidates at the top of the tick and go, I don't like either one of them. We did a podcast on that a couple of weeks ago, and we pointed out you're not voting for one person. You're voting for 5,000 people to go to Washington and implement an agenda. So you're not voting for one person. And we've been through the platforms on here before, but let me just summarize some of the main issues here. Democrats want an open border. Republicans don't. Democrats want federal funding for abortion until birth. Republicans don't. Democrats want to transition children against the will of their parents. And they'll take the kids from the parents, as we've been talking about on this show. Republicans don't want to do that. Democrats want men and women showers in sports. Republicans don't. Democrats want laws that will take away certain religious rights, as we just mentioned with the so-called Equality Act. Republicans don't. Is there anything you want to add to that, Laura, in regard to the platforms now? Because we're beyond personalities now, and we're talking about policies.
I mean, that covers it pretty well. It's really a culture of death in many ways. I mean, if we care about children, about protecting their minds, their hearts, their souls, their bodies, and care about them growing up in families that are going to nurture and love them, then I feel like we don't have a choice to just stay home. I mean, there's so much at stake here. 4 years actually was a lot more damage than I expected. And it's worse now than it was, and it'll get a whole lot worse. Yes,
you are correct. Things have gotten so much worse in the past 4 years. Not that the Republican platform is perfect. It's not. But you rarely get everything you want anyway, ladies and gentlemen. As Gary Hamrick said, he asked the question, are you married? And everyone laughed. Yeah, your spouse isn't perfect, is he or she? No, okay, but you still made the decision to go with that person. And the same thing is true, ladies and gentlemen, on Tuesday, or if you're voting before then. You're not voting for perfect platforms or perfect people. In fact, who was it? It was Calvin Robinson. I don't know if you know who he is, Laura. He's an Anglican priest who now he was from the UK. Now he's here in America. He said, Jesus is not on the ballot, but Jezebel is. So vote accordingly, ladies and gentlemen. Go to voteyourfaith.net, voteyourfaith.net for so many presentations and that digital voter guide to help you make an informed biblical decision. Laura, thank you so much for all your work and for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me and for discussing these issues that are so important for all of us.
Very important issues. Thanks for your fine work. And thanks to Jay Richards, too, for getting you involved in this. This is just, you guys are amazing. So keep doing the work you're doing. Friends, go to voteyourfaith.net. At least vote. James says, if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, it's a sin. It's a sin of omission. Go out there and vote against this kind of evil. All right, see you here next week, Lord willing. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.